You've been in the dirt for weeks, eating stale bread and weak ale. But finally, it's your day off. Sounds amazing, right? Don't celebrate yet. Prepare to discover why a medieval peasant's day of freedom was anything but relaxing, and why modern days off should make you feel lucky to be alive today. Working from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. You'd think a day off would mean a chance to finally rest. A slow morning, maybe a little time to yourself. But in medieval England, a day off didn't mean lounging around with nothing to do. The whole idea of leisure back then was so far removed from what we think of today, you might not even recognize it. Forget lazy Sunday mornings or Netflix binges. For a medieval peasant, a day off came with its own set of rules, rituals, and, wait for it, responsibilities. First, let's be clear on what a day off actually was. Most peasants didn't have a personal calendar to plan their time. Their lives revolved around the agricultural season, and the rhythm was set by the local church. Rest days, if they happened at all, were almost always tied to religious observances. Festivals, saints' days, and holy feasts were your days off. But even then, this wasn't about free time. It wasn't a day to do nothing. It was a day to do different things. Take a typical feast day, for example. This wasn't the medieval version of a weekend barbecue. The day usually began with a mandatory church service. Attendance wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. You'd wake up early, just like any other day, because religious rituals dictated the start of the day. The community would gather, listen to long sermons in Latin, which most people couldn't understand, and take part in prayers and hymns. The church wasn't just a place for spiritual reflection, it was a central authority in your life. Skipping out on Mass wasn't an option unless you wanted to earn the judgmental stares and whispers of your neighbors, and possibly a fine or public humiliation, depending on how serious the offense was. And even though it was a day off, it wasn't exactly restful. After leaving Mass, there'd be communal duties to take care of. These could range from prepping food for a communal feast to setting up for celebrations in the village square. These tasks weren't negotiable. They were just another form of unpaid labor, wrapped up in the guise of religion or community spirit. No one asked if you were too tired from plowing fields the day before. If you were part of the village, you pitched in, no matter what. It's worth pausing here to reflect on why these days existed at all. Unlike today, where days off are seen as a personal right or a chance to recharge, these feasts and holy days served as a way to reinforce social structures. The church made the rules, and the peasants followed along. Each saint's day or holy feast was carefully calculated into the annual calendar to break up the monotony of work, while keeping the community under religious and social control. In a way, it wasn't just a day off from physical labor in the fields. It was a reminder of your position in society. You worked hard, you prayed harder, and you didn't question the system because it was baked into every aspect of your life. Now, if you're wondering exactly how many of these so-called free days peasants actually got, historians estimate it wasn't as grim as modern work weeks. On paper, at least. Between holy days and seasonal festivals, peasants might technically get upwards of 50 to 80 days off each year, far more than most modern workers. But there's a catch. These weren't evenly spaced. You might get a few feast days bunched up during certain times of the year, like Easter or Christmas, and then go months without a single break. And as we've seen, those breaks weren't really about rest. So yes, more days off, but less actual downtime. Let's get back to that feast day. Imagine halfway through the day, the communal tasks are done, and now it's time for the so-called fun part. The village might gather for a celebratory meal or seasonal games. On paper, this sounds nice, a break from the repeated monotony of tilling, sowing, and harvesting. But were these meals and gatherings free from pressure? Not exactly. The church still kept a close watch, ensuring that the day's festivities didn't spiral into sin or disorder. Think you could sneak in a little excess drinking or merrymaking? Not without consequences. Peasants had to walk a tightrope between enjoying themselves and staying within the boundaries of moral expectations, expectations imposed not just by the church, but also by their own community. Food at these feasts wasn't exactly flowing freely either. This was a time of scarcity, after all. The communal feast might feature some rare treats. Think a bit of roasted meat or maybe even cheese, but it often relied heavily on the same foods that sustained peasants every other day of the year. Bread, pottage, and occasionally some vegetables or fish were staples. Think about how much effort went into preparing even that simple meal. Women especially had to organize and cook for dozens of people over an open flame, pounding dough and peeling vegetables by hand. For them, the day might have been even harder than a typical workday in the fields. And then there were the games and communal activities. If anyone had energy left after preparing the feast and fulfilling religious obligations, they might participate in a village football match or an archery contest. But this wasn't recreation as we think of it. These games were chaotic, often violent, and probably left you more bruised and battered than before. Imagine unregulated matches of mob football, where there were barely any rules and the goal was basically to move a ball across the village while everyone shoved, tripped, and tackled each other. It was less a game and more an outlet for frustration, a pressure valve for a life that offered little in the way of joy or comfort. In the end, a day off wasn't truly a reprieve. It was a shift from one kind of work to another, a grind with a slightly different rhythm. Sure, there might have been moments of laughter or satisfaction, but the structure of your life always loomed in the background. Every event, every meal, and every game reminded you of where you stood in the grand order of things. It wasn't about personal freedom, it was about communal responsibility, religious devotion, and occasionally keeping up appearances. So, no, your day off wasn't really yours. By the time the sun started setting, it was less about relaxation and more about ticking off another box before returning to the dirt and grind in the morning. And the next challenge. What counted as fun back then might have been even more exhausting than your regular routine. It's your day off, right? A chance to stay in bed, if only for a few precious hours. Except no, there's the sound of the church bell cutting through the damp morning air. Loud, constant, and inescapable. It's not a gentle chime either. It's the kind of clang that rattles your brain awake before you've even opened your eyes. Forget dreaming about sleeping in. You're already behind schedule. That sound is the medieval alarm clock, and like everything else in your life, it doesn't care how exhausted you are. The church bells are not just for decoration or marking the time, they rule your day with military precision. This is especially true on a feast day, your so-called day off, when they serve an even more important purpose, calling every single person in the village to mass. No excuses, no exceptions. The first ring means it's time to get moving, and the second is to make sure you're on your way. You throw on the only clothes you own, hopefully mended enough to look presentable, and tread the muddy path toward the church. You're not alone, though. The entire village is trudging along beside you, bleary-eyed and stiff from yesterday's labor. It's a miserable parade of shared exhaustion, moving toward a cold, stone building that's just as gloomy as you feel. Inside the church, it's not much better. The air is damp, particularly in the cooler months, and the stone walls seem to trap it. The faint smell of incense and unwashed bodies mixes with the earthy scent from the dirt floor. There's no such thing as heating, of course, and the windows are small and glassless, meaning drafts creep in from every direction. You sit with the rest of the congregation, shifting awkwardly on crude wooden benches or standing for what feels like an eternity. The priest begins the service, speaking in Latin, a language that might as well be another world to you and your neighbors. The rhythm of the prayers is familiar. It's been drilled into you since childhood, but do you actually understand much of it? Probably not. Still, showing up isn't optional. Attending Mass is as much a community obligation as it is a religious one. To skip it would draw all the wrong kinds of attention. If you're not there, the absence is noticed, and depending on who's preaching that day, somebody's likely to point it out. It's not just about satisfying spiritual needs, it's about social survival. The church oversees more than your prayers. It manages marriages, births, deaths, disputes over land, and even village gossip. Skipping Mass is basically asking for trouble, branding you as lazy, careless, or, worst of all, sinful. A reputation like that sticks in a small community where trust and cooperation are literally the difference between eating and starving through winter. But the thing is, you're not here to relax or reflect. This isn't a peaceful sanctuary where you can take a breath after weeks bent over in the fields. No, this is another demand on your already drained energy. The service is long, often over an hour, and standing still in the cold doesn't give your aching muscles any kind of relief. If there's a feast or celebration planned for later, you're probably already worrying about what needs to be done next. Sitting in that church, you'd feel the weight of the day ahead pressing down on you before it even starts. The whole structure of your life revolves around the church, not just on feast days, but every day. The bell tells you when to wake up, when to eat, and when to go to bed. It rings for Mass, for meetings, and even for emergencies. Sure, it might seem like a simple tool for organizing life, but it's more than that. The bell is a reminder, loud and unrelenting, that you are part of something bigger, and that something holds power over you. Even your day off is regulated by its metallic voice and the dictates of those who control it. And yet, there's something more profound about this unyielding routine. In medieval society, the church wasn't just the center, it was the framework. Every law, every festival, every so-called break from labor was wrapped in layers of religious significance. Even leisure was seen as a spiritual matter, something that strengthened the community and honored God rather than indulged the individual. The idea of rest for its own sake. That didn't exist. Leisure had to align with religious or communal duties, or it didn't count. Skipping ahead mentally to the moment the service ends, you might feel a flicker of relief. But don't get too comfortable. This is just the start of the day. Once Mass wraps up, you and your weary neighbors file out of the church and get ready for whatever comes next. Maybe it's preparations for a feast, or maybe it's festive games in the village square. Either way, anything you're about to do will. Still take effort, a lot of it. You might be crushing grain, helping to set up tables, or hauling water, all while pretending this is leisure. And let's not forget what being absent from these communal activities would mean. It's not just about disappointing your priest or upsetting your neighbors. In small medieval villages, the concept of individual time didn't really exist. Everything revolved around communal effort. Your survival depended on the group, and so you were expected to show up physically and spiritually. Even if your back ached and your feet hurt, there wasn't space for opting out. That expectation weighed heavily. Whether you were tending crops, hauling firewood, or trying to appear engaged in a sermon you didn't understand. The reality is, by lunchtime, and yes, lunch would barely deserve the term, you're likely eating twice-baked bread and whatever leftovers you could scrounge. You're already just as tired as any other day, maybe more so. The irony of this break isn't lost on you, though you'd never say it out loud. Why complain? This is the rhythm of life, and you've known it since you were a child. Questioning it won't make the day any easier. And speaking up might even drag tomorrow down with you. So, even as the bell's echo fades and your stomach growls its own reminder to keep moving, you might take a deep breath and press on. After all, half the day is still ahead. If you thought the morning was demanding, just wait. The next round of leisure might leave you questioning whether rest is even a thing in medieval life, or if it's just another word for work. Think fun and games meant relief in medieval England? Not quite. Sure, a day off came with leisure activities, but the idea of fun back then often left you more battered than when you started. Here, games weren't about relaxation. They were about competition. Imagine trying to unwind in a chaotic, unregulated free-for-all that could break bones as easily as it brought moments of joy. First, picture one of the most infamous activities, mob football, if you can even call it a game. The rules? Practically non-existent. The teams? Pretty much the entire village on one side versus the neighboring village on the other. The goal was simple. Get a ball, usually made of leather or something equally solid, to a designated area by any means necessary. And by any means, I do mean anything. There were no referees, no whistles, and definitely no penalty cards. Pushing, shoving, tackling, and tripping, all fair play. If you think modern football gets rough, this was barely organised chaos, teetering between a sport and an on-the-spot battleground. Injuries weren't a rarity, they were inevitable. A bloody nose, normal. A twisted ankle, you'd count yourself lucky. Let's say you're in the thick of it, the sun beating down, your legs heavy from running across uneven terrain. Dozens, if not hundreds of people are crashing into each other, surging like waves around the ball. You've managed to grab it for half a second before someone slams into your back, and suddenly you're in a pile of elbows, knees, and dust. You crawl out, coughing and clutching your ribs, only to see the game raging on 20 feet ahead. This wasn't a quick match either. The game could last for hours, spilling across fields, streams, even through the narrow alleyways of the village. If you weren't bruised by the end, you'd probably spent the entire match running in the opposite direction. And remember, this was meant to be leisure. The truth is, mob football wasn't just about sport. In fact, historians suggest it served as an outlet for the frustrations and pent-up energy of a hard, physically demanding life. You weren't just competing for a win. You were venting weeks of exhaustion and stress. Life in medieval England didn't offer many moments to let loose, so when a game like this came around, it was less about fun and more about sheer release. Those competitive instincts, ingrained by years of strain and scarcity, played out in ways that would look shocking by today's standards. Winning wasn't just pride. It was a rare, fleeting victory in a life of constant toil. Not every game was quite as chaotic as mob football, though the physical demands were still high. Archery contests, for example, were another common pastime. And while they may sound calm in comparison, they were no walk in the park. First, you needed skill, lots of it. Archery was more than just a game. It was a survival skill, and for some, even a legal obligation. By law, men were often required to practice with a bow regularly, preparing them for military service or defense if needed. So, while an archery contest might seem like a fun little competition, it doubled as something much more serious, which meant the stakes were just a bit higher. You couldn't afford to embarrass yourself in front of the village. Think about what using a longbow would have been like. These weren't lightweight, modern replicas. These were heavy wooden bows that required serious upper body strength to use effectively. You'd hold that taut string, muscles straining and fingers aching, sweat trickling down your temples as you aimed. Hitting the target was a mix of skill, patience, and endurance, not a pickup hobby, but something drilled into you through years of practice. And if you were hoping for a nice prize at the end, well, maybe you'd get a handful of pride and the admiration of your neighbors. That's about it. Not exactly a relaxing afternoon. Even games with less structure could quickly turn physical. Wrestling was another popular activity, and it didn't come with fluffy mats or padded headgear. This was medieval wrestling, done on bare dirt or packed grass, with no real rules except don't back down. The goal? Pin your opponent to the ground by force or strategy. The result? Sore shoulders, scraped knees, and an ego bruised even worse if you lost. But again, like other games, it wasn't strictly about entertainment. Wrestling showcased strength, critical thinking, and resilience, qualities that were necessary to survive the grind of peasant life. Everything, even play, had a purpose. At first glance, the sheer effort thrown into these games might seem confusing. Why would a bunch of exhausted peasants willingly spend their one precious day off on something that could leave them limping back to their hut? The key lies in how different medieval leisure was compared to what we expect today. Unlike now, when we associate free time with ease and comfort, think lounging, TV, hot showers, the medieval concept of leisure didn't prioritize rest. Instead, these activities reflected the hardiness of these people, built by a world that offered little room for softness. A break from farming wasn't about taking it easy. It was about shifting from one challenge to another, often with the added pressure of showing off your skills. The communal nature of these games also can't be ignored. Life in a medieval village wasn't exactly rosy, but moments like this brought people together, reinforcing bonds and shared identity. Winning a bruising bout of mob football wasn't just personal, it united your team, maybe even your entire village. Cooperation overlapped with competition, and the physical hardships that came with these games mirrored the strains of daily life. Everyone was bruised, battered, and exhausted, but they were in it, together. If you compare this to modern leisure, the kind with cozy blankets, movie marathons, and snacks, it would seem absurd to trade farming for a brutal game of whatever rules-optional activity the village decided on. But the context back then gave these moments meaning. For a peasant, what mattered wasn't comfort. It was survival, community, and the occasional spark of triumph amid a life defined by monotony. Aching muscles, small price to pay. By the time those games were over, if they even ended before sunset, you'd be dragging yourself back home with dirt-streaked skin, a bruise or two, and maybe, just maybe, a fleeting sense of accomplishment. That's the thing about medieval fun. It wasn't really about relaxing your body. It was about escaping the grind of the fields, even if only to find a new kind of exhausting challenge. And speaking of challenges, the next part of your so-called day off had its own struggles, because once the games wrapped up, it was time for the feast. And that had its own battles to fight. A feast sounds like the highlight of a peasant's year, doesn't it? A proper celebration, complete with food, drink, and maybe even music. But before you picture a banquet straight out of a medieval storybook, let's set the scene. A feast day was less about indulging and more about, surviving the amount of work it took to make it happen. By the time you sat down to eat, chances are the smell of the hearth still clung to your clothes. Your hands were sore from peeling tough root vegetables, and your temper might have been tipping toward exhaustion. Frankly, the only thing separating a medieval feast from another workday was the chance to eat something other than pottage. Maybe. For starters, feast days revolved around food and ritual, but they didn't happen magically. Someone had to organize and prepare everything, and that responsibility often landed squarely on the women in the village. Men might have been out wrangling livestock or setting up outdoor tables, but inside it was chaos in the cooking space. Kitchens back then weren't what you'd imagine from a modern dining show. No sleek ovens or convenient timers, just an open hearth, smoky air, and an endless list of things that needed chopping, grinding, peeling, or boiling. Forget appliances. You were working with basic tools, and those didn't make the job easier. They just made it barely possible. Imagine this. You're up at dawn after a night of restless sleep on a straw-stuffed mat because, yes, even feast days start early. The morning is spent gathering ingredients. Root vegetables are pulled straight from the earth and still clumped with dirt. Bread dough needs kneading, and since there's no yeast packet in sight, you're relying on sourdough starters or barley flour that's likely coarse enough to scrape the inside of your mouth. Water for boiling or brewing needs to be drawn by hand from the village's communal well, hauled back in heavy wooden buckets. And all the while, the fire in the hearth has to be maintained. Managing the flames without burning your stew or yourself is its own kind of skill, one you don't get a break from. Oh, and let's not forget that all of this is happening while dodging children underfoot or chasing off the occasional wandering chicken that's far too comfortable cramming itself under the cooking table. And livestock doesn't take the day off either. Animals need feeding before you even start thinking about feeding people. But let's talk about the food itself. For most peasants, the daily diet was downright monotonous. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, was standard. It wasn't bad necessarily, just repetitive, and it wasn't exactly bursting with flavor. A feast, by contrast, might offer rare, coveted treats. If someone had managed to slaughter a pig or goat, you might see roasted meat on the table. And that was a big deal. Bread sometimes stepped up its game too, with finer flours saved for special occasions instead of the usual gritty, heavy loaves. Ale was distributed liberally, but if you imagined a crisp pint with frothy bubbles, scale that expectation way back. This wasn't your craft brewery variety. It was something weaker, less refined, and closer to liquid bread than a refreshing drink. Even with a better menu, the actual flavor of the food had its limitations, thanks to scarce and expensive spices. A single pinch of pepper could cost more than a poor laborer's monthly wages. So while the rich might have their heavily spiced meats and sugary puddings, you were likely experiencing much milder fare. Think earthy, smoky, and, let's call it, hearty. And don't get too excited about portion sizes either. Serving a whole village or community on slaughtered meat and bread was about stretching those rare ingredients as far as possible. Hunger didn't simply vanish because a saint's day made the calendar feel more festive. Now, preparing this meal wasn't just about surviving the open flames and pressure to make enough food. There was also the danger of the food itself. Without modern refrigeration or preservation techniques, certain things were far more adventurous to eat. Meat might have been hung to cure for days, sometimes too many days. Bread could be bulked up with anything from old flour to wood shavings to make it go further. Some dairy products were, let's say, on the strong side of fermenting. And yet, people ate heartily because they had to. Every meal was a gamble, but no one could afford to sit it out. Finally, you actually reached the meal itself. You'd think this would be the part where things get easier. Sit down, eat, enjoy. But even this wasn't exactly restful. Feasts were communal, which meant eating alongside everyone else in the village. Meals were shared in large, chaotic gatherings where etiquette was dictated less by manners and more by necessity. This wasn't about savoring flavors or sipping on warm ale by a crackling fire. It was about getting enough to fill your stomach before someone else grabbed the last of the bread or the remaining scraps of meat. Conversations were loud, but they carried weight too. This was as much a social event as it was a meal. People used these moments to gossip, forge connections, or even hash out simmering disputes. Of course, the work didn't end when the eating did. The cleanup was its own beast. You'd be left scrubbing pots caked with soot, sweeping up leftover crumbs, or chasing scavenger dogs out of the dining area. By the time the feast officially wrapped up, you'd feel more drained than pleased. Sure, it was special, a rare glimpse of foods your daily life didn't usually allow, a chance to laugh or catch up with your neighbors. But it was never easy. What's fascinating about a medieval feast is how it managed to be both a break from the everyday grind and a stark example of it. Everything required effort, huge amounts, in fact, and yet people still found joy in the small differences that made a feast feel, at least momentarily, like something worth celebrating. Food, no matter how basic or risky, was enjoyed as more than just bare sustenance. And in a life as harsh as this, that distinction mattered. But the feast didn't just fill bellies. It filled a deeper need as well, a sense of connection, solidarity, and shared survival. And for a medieval peasant, that rare feeling of unity, even amid the soot-streaked chaos, might have been the most precious part of all. Next, we'll see how these moments of celebration and connection became an opportunity for conversation, reflection, and inevitably, judgment. Because even in gatherings of joy, the watchful eyes of the community were never far away. When you spend nearly every waking moment working, hauling, digging, tending, and surviving, just sitting down to talk with someone feels almost indulgent. On feast days, those rare, fragile breaks from the grind, the moments of connection during communal gatherings were often treasured just as much as the food or the games. Finally, you'd have a chance to hear stories, share your worries, or quietly sit and reflect, free, at least temporarily, from the dirt and sweat of daily life. Well, mostly free. It's by the fire after the feast, surrounded by neighbors whose faces feel as familiar as your own, that things start to slow down, if only slightly. People lean in close, warming their hands, their voices low at first, then growing louder as the ale jars make their rounds. You might find yourself talking about a bad harvest, a new patch of land you're trying to coax into growing crops, or even a bit of news about the manor lord. Someone might share advice on mending tools or discuss whether the old oak tree by the churchyard is truly cursed or just lucky. That depends on who you're asking. Gossip, though, floats through the air as reliably as the sparks from the fire. But here's the thing. You can't fully relax. No one living under the watchful eye of medieval social and religious norms truly could. The church was a presence you could never quite ignore, even during these snatches of downtime. Remember, the priest was often nearby, either at the fire himself or barely out of earshot, and moral expectations followed you everywhere, even through conversations. What seemed like casual chatter one moment could quickly take a turn if a complaint or comment was deemed inappropriate. And if you attempted to let loose or speak freely, there was always a part of your brain holding you back. It wasn't just the priest you had to worry about either, it was your neighbors. Gossiping was a two-sided coin. You might hear someone else's secret today, but tomorrow, your words could become fuel for whispers you hadn't bargained for. Worse still, the casual judgment that hung in the air wasn't idle. It could hold real consequences. The tight bonds of a village meant everyone's business was, in essence, everyone else's. A single comment about skipping mass or not pulling your weight during feast preparations could ripple outward. Was she pious enough? Was he shirking his duties? These doubts could lay the groundwork for serious consequences, because questioning the moral framework, even passively, was dangerous. Lives had unraveled on far less. And as the church's influence kept every interaction threaded with the fear of sin, you always felt yourself glancing over your shoulder, metaphorically speaking. The church's grip on these gatherings was both visible and invisible. On one hand, feast days were directly tied to the church calendar, making them inextricably religious events. Every activity, Every pause carried some layer of spirituality or moral oversight, whether through evident rituals or subtle social pressures. On the other hand, the church utilized gatherings like these to reinforce its authority. Neighbors, whether they realized it or not, acted as extensions of that power, their judgments mirroring the church's larger expectations. This wasn't just about sharing a meal or reflecting by the fire, it was also a way to keep everyone in check. Take confession, for example, an unavoidable part of most feast days. Before you even arrived at the church that morning, you probably spent time mentally cataloguing your misdeeds, hoping you wouldn't forget anything that could land you in spiritual trouble. Confession before the priest was more than an obligation. It was a reminder of just how closely your life was regulated. And that regulation didn't end when the church service stopped. The eyes of your neighbors, your friends, even your family, they all became extensions of that confessional booth. You weren't supposed to sin in obvious ways, but you also weren't free to hide behind your own closed doors. Life was public, even when it felt intimate. Now imagine sitting by that fire and someone brings up an oddly empty cart spotted outside a neighbor's shed. A few muttered suggestions grow into full whispers, and before long everyone's collectively wondering if someone skimmed off the grain they were supposed to deliver to the manor lord. Even if it's just idle speculation, the mere suggestion could spread into something worse. That neighbor might wake up to find hushed conversations stop altogether as they approach, or worse, receive a visit from an official or a stern word from the priest. Every act of defiance, real or imagined, became part of an endless cycle of scrutiny. And yet gossip was also vital. It gave people power in a world where they had little. It was both the weapon and the shield. Still, not all these moments were heavy or shadowed by judgment. For some, it was the first chance in weeks to sit still and reflect on something other than survival. The crackle of the fire and the low hum of voices could offer a sense of comfort, fleeting as it was. Tales and superstitions were shared generously during these times. Someone might talk about a mysterious glow near the marshes last All Hallows Eve, or recount what they swore was the last dying wish of a drifting beggar. Stories also worked as a reminder of shared identity. Everyone sitting there had experienced the same cycles of toil, hunger, and the occasional joy. This connection, rare and fragile, ran deeper than the constant undercurrent of fear and judgment. But these moments didn't last long. The fire would die down eventually, and responsibilities always loomed just beyond the feast day. The chickens needed tending before morning, the hearth needed sweeping, and the fields would still be waiting at sunrise. The church bells, which had dictated your morning, would soon call you again. And once this day ended, it wouldn't feel much like time off at all. Even as the fire flickered out, there was little space for full relief in the life of a medieval peasant. These rare pauses of conversation or reflection broke the constant rhythm of physical labor, but the mental weight of sin, of judgment, of survival never disappeared. There was no freedom to simply be. Even in their most tender moments, peasants never truly escaped the grip of expectations, whether they came from the church, the community, or their own aching consciences. As you brush the ash from your clothes and begin the slow walk home, that heaviness still lingers. You'd wonder how it was possible to feel worn out after what's supposed to be a day of rest. And tomorrow? You'd be right back at it, no matter how you left the feast. By the time the sun sets again, you'll truly understand just how unrelenting this life could be. The sun is setting, streaking the sky with reds and oranges, and you're trudging back home, every muscle in your body aching. The games are done, the feast is over, and you might think, just for a fleeting moment, that this so-called day off is finally at an end. But you'd be wrong. The animals still need feeding, tools need mending, and tomorrow the fields will be waiting for you. There's no true off button here, no magical escape from responsibility just because the church declared the day a holy one. As the light fades, the day shifts yet again into another kind of work. If you're lucky enough to have a cow or a pig, that means it's still on you to make sure they're fed before night fully takes over. The chickens need to be herded back into the coop, and maybe you'll be lucky enough to snag an egg or two, lifting one carefully out of a filthy nest that smells like every insult to hygiene you can imagine. The bucket you draw water with has splinters that catch your palms, and dinner isn't waiting for you. You'll scrape together something from what's left of the feast, or more likely just gnaw on some hard bread, which, honestly, might be dense enough to double as a building material. At this point, you're probably too tired to care, but your day doesn't stop when the chores do. Once you've tended to the animals and squared away the communal leftovers, there's still tomorrow staring you down. Your tools, dulled from weeks of endless labor, require sharpening. Your clothes, many of which you've outgrown but can't afford to replace, are wearing so thin it feels like they're made of cobwebs. That single patch tunic you own has probably seen 5 winters already, but you sit there in the dim firelight weaving another piece of cloth over the latest tear, feeling how rough the fabric is from years of use. Your hands, calloused and cracked, barely flinch anymore when the needle scrapes against your skin. Eventually, you collapse onto your bed, or at least what passes for one. It's a straw mattress, more imagined than useful by this point, flattened from years of weight and neglect. Mattress feels like too generous a word anyway, doesn't it? It's just a sack stuffed with old hay, now soft enough to offer fleas and lice a prime vacation spot. You can hear them skittering around, not that it's anything new. The sensation of bites, the constant itching. It's something you've mostly learned to live with. You've probably even given up trying to slap them away. What would be the point? Smells like a barn floor because it was a barn floor 3 months ago, you think, with the kind of grim humor that keeps you sane. The rest of the room doesn't offer much comfort either. The air inside the wooden hut you call home is sharp and damp all at once. The lack of proper insulation means drafts snake their way through the gaps in the walls. It's almost as cold inside as it is out. You've got one wool blanket to pull over yourself. Heavy, sure, but coarse and scratchy from years of unwashed use. If the mice haven't chewed through it, you'll count that as a small victory. The sounds of the hut are hardly soothing, too. If you're not hearing the restless snorting of your goat, since, yes, you share living space with your animals, then it's probably the muffled cries of the baby 2 doors down, or the late-night bickering of neighbors who live close enough that their arguments might as well be in your ear. Peace? What's that? And if you think all of this is bad, let's talk about the food still sitting in your stomach. That rare taste of meat you savored earlier was nice while it lasted, but now it's just sitting there, heavy and greasy, working against your body instead of for it. It's probably better than your usual fare. Pottage, that thick, gloopy stew of boiled grains and vegetables. But the truth is, even on a feast day, it's not doing much for your energy levels. Your diet is a slow-motion disaster, giving you just enough calories to keep moving, but never enough to truly fuel you. Bread hard enough to deflect arrows, overcooked greens, and weak ale round out the menu most days. And as you lie there, too tired to move but not comfortable enough to fall asleep, you remember the sharp truth. Your tiredness isn't just from today. It's been building up for years. Sleep, of course, isn't much of a solution. Even if you manage to drift off, It's hardly restorative when your back is pressed against uneven straw and you're constantly adjusting to avoid the bites of bedbugs. You're just trading the pain in your legs for the dull throb shooting up your neck. And the knowledge that the church bell will start ringing before sunrise isn't exactly soothing either. That dull clang will pull you from whatever scraps of sleep you've managed to find, and the whole cycle will begin again. It's like the universe itself is conspiring to keep you in this state of perpetual exhaustion. And it's not just your body that's worn down by sunset, it's your mind too. The precariousness of life looms over everything here. The smallest injury could spiral into catastrophe. Even a bad cut might get infected, and without any decent medical knowledge, something as simple as a toothache could escalate to something life-threatening. These thoughts stick in the back of your head, just another weight to carry as you lay there staring up at the dark rafters. You calculate what needs to be done tomorrow, wondering if the weather will hold up, if the yields will last the winter, or if the manor lord will demand something extra you can't spare. And then, because you can't help it, you wonder about everyone else lying in their huts nearby, all of you enduring the same endless grind. You remind yourself there's no real escape, not from the work, or the church bells, or the dirt floor you call a home. By now, it's clear. A day off wasn't really a break at all. It wasn't a chance to recharge or step away from the constant demands of the land. It was just a shift, a brief change of scenery that left your body just as worn and your mind just as burdened. The line between work and rest didn't blur. It barely existed. For you, like every other peasant, rest was an idea, not a reality. By the time your eyelids finally close, the only comfort you'll find is knowing you've survived another day. Tomorrow, that hard life will pick right back up, as relentless as ever. Even on their best days, medieval peasants lived lives defined by relentless struggle. Their day off wasn't rest. It was a shift in responsibilities, leaving them just as drained by sunset. From exhausting feast preparations to dangerous games and the ever-watchful eye of the church, no moment was truly free from pressure. Now think about your own life. Running water, warm meals, no fleas in your bed. Small comforts we take for granted were luxuries they couldn't imagine. Next time you're sipping coffee in your pajamas, remember, your entire day might have been their dream. Funny how perspective works, isn't it?